Good morning, namaskar to all our viewers, all our learners with us. Welcome to CEC Gurukul live lectures. The topic that we will be trying to understand today and learn further on it is culture and global politics. I am Dr. Amna. I teach political science at Shyama Prasad Mukherjee College for Women, University of Delhi. Now, the topic that we try to understand today is culture and global politics. How we have structured the learning over the course of time today is that we will first try to understand how and where and when does the idea of culture becomes important for global politics. What was it that the current contemporary thinking in global politics required a rethinking, reimagination, wherein culture had its due space. And then from there on, we will be trying to revisit some of the very important works in global politics where culture has played an important role. Now, we all know that, when we are trying to understand global politics, when we are trying to understand international relations per se, in the mainstream IR, there was this idea that realism is the primal idea. There was the idea that realist theories were the main theory to explain the contours of international politics. However, there was a criticism, and the criticism was that it had a completely one-sided perspective. It tried to focus on one realm of global politics, which was primarily the North American perspective, or perhaps there were certain kind of biases that is primarily being situated towards Eurocentrism. And then there was this idea that is division between high politics and low politics. That is, high politics, an area where international, in the relations of international realm, its national interests, hard power, military supremacy, that is important. Over the period of time, the ambit of domestic politics was questioned. This questioning of the ambit of global politics by certain kind of forces that were not included in the hitherto high politics domain, and then with the rise of notions like soft power, somewhere issues from domestic politics, issues from the realm of hitherto low politics also came to be under analysis for issues pertaining to global politics. Now, we all know that in the contemporary international relations scenario, in theory as well as in practice, when we look at from working of certain international organizations, when we look at some of the policy analysis, policy points of international summits, there is an investigation into the diverse form of culture, diverse issues of popular culture, issues of mainstream versus parallel culture, and how are they impacting relationships between and amongst nation. Now, this is a sub-discipline that is, to name, for example, popular culture and world politics. All of it is gradually coming under analysis. There are studies being done, research networks are being established that shows that how culture is a significant point of analysis for world international diplomacy. Culture is a significant point of analysis while understanding behavior of organizations when we look at the multinational and transnational organizations, and culture is also an important issue for domestic churnings also of a particular nation state, which definitely has a linkage with global politics also. And looking at this paramount importance, international relations theory as well as practices of the global affairs are not immune from this larger issue of significance of culture. Now, let's understand what do we mean by culture. Now, culture is a pervasive term. By pervasive, we mean that for literary theory, for literature, for sociology, for political science, and for management sciences also, the culture, the idea of culture, the ambit of culture has a huge significance. And one of the reasons here is because human beings are social beings, and this entire process of socialization has an important linkage with culture. Culture is an umbrella term, we can say. It encompasses social behavior, social norms. And where do we situate the social behavior and social norms? Human societies, as well as in the knowledge system, the belief paraphernalia, the arts, the laws, the customs, capabilities, habits of the individuals in these groups. So all of it which get together to codify and signify culture of a particular terrain. Now, we've taken this definition from popular Google resources. That is, by culture we mean an umbrella term to encompass social behavior, norms of a human society. Now, again, when you're saying that when we are defining culture, so therefore we say that there are shared patterns of behavior, shared patterns of interaction, followed by which there are cognitive constructs and understanding that are learned by socialization. So we see that the idea of culture has lot of social processes that are involved within it, and somewhere because social processes today are becoming complex. Primarily, what is global is connected to local, and what is local definitely has a linkage today with what is global. Looking at this vantage point, to understand culture at shared patterns of behavior and interaction, cognitive constructs, we see that culture definitely has important stakes then for global politics. And then we have taken resource from lifescience.com here to understand culture in a much more myriad sense. So, let's get into the etymology of the word culture. The word culture is coming from a French word, which in terms is coming from a Latin word, that is colere, which means that is to tend to the earth, grow, cultivation, nurture. So therefore, when we are trying to understand the deep meaning in the very word culture, we see that the idea of growth together, the idea of nurturing together, or the idea of cultivation of a civilization together is some of the ambits as well as significant functions that are performed by the very significant milieu of culture. Now, when we are trying to understand culture, another term that comes into mind here is diversity. Now, diversity signifies that each country has its own culture. Each aspect of the hemisphere of the globe has its own culture. For example, if I take some of the references from the Khan University, the term Western culture, it signifies, when we invoke the word Western culture, what does it signify? The first thing that comes across the mind is it is a culture of European countries as well as those who have been influenced by European immigration, United States. Then Western culture has its roots in the classical period of the Greco-Roman area. Then another, as a contrast to Western culture, in the popular discourse we use the word Eastern culture. Now, by the term Eastern culture, once again the reference to geography is taken. That is, societal norms of countries in the Far East, China, Japan, Vietnam, North Korea, South Korea. So all of it shows that how the understanding of culture is often in the first thinking sense, is tied to the idea of a geography. Then Western, Eastern, then comes the culture of Latin America. By Latin, in the geographical troposphere, we see that it is Central America, South America, Mexico, and quite often Culture then is also linked to language discourse. For example, Spanish and Portuguese are dominant languages of the Latin American countries, and often countries are making effort also to safeguard their language policies in a manner that secures their domestic identity as well as caters to their national interests at the global level. Therefore, debates within the realm of culture are significant for domestic as well as global relations for any country. Now, when we are trying to understand culture, a very significant term that came, which led to a lot of transmission as well as changes, is the idea of globalization. As we have always learned that the idea of globalization, which implies interchange, exchange, is nothing new. It has existed even in the past. But what is essential here is that globalization in the contemporary times, being driven by neoliberal economics, led to space-time compression. Once globalization leads to space-time compression, somewhere because of rampant exchange of ideas, movements of goods and services, globalization in its various dimensions, political, economic, technological, cultural too, had an influence. For example, in the political dimension, there is a debate in terms of displacement of authority from the state towards the transnational market forces. In the realm of economics, there is a debate of increase in movement of capital with respect to whether there has been due increase in movement of labor too. In the realm of technology, it is the technological dimension because of rampant technological advances in information technology and communication that is being always argued that made the phase of globalization exist and take forward further. Then when we are trying to discuss cultural globalization, by cultural globalization we imply transmission of ideas, meanings, values around the world in such a way to extend and intensify social relations. Now, once this extension and intensification of social relations happen, it has its own pros as well as its cons that we will learn in the debates to come in the lecture. So, when we look at globalization and culture, there is an intensification and expansion of cultural flows across the globe. But however, there is a debate. Is the world becoming more hegemonized or Americanized or homogenized? And there is an alternate debate that has globalization reinvigorated cultural niche instead of eliminating them? So the debate between unity versus diversity, the idea of heterogeneous versus homogeneous, the idea of protecting the indigenous versus the outside is always at debate here, because diversity is a term that is always being debated side by side when we are trying to understand culture. And most important, another term that we are always looking at when we are trying to understand culture is that how are cultures being revamped in this process. Now, at the same time, there is this idea of global village, that how all the different parts of the world from one community are linked together. Today, if we look at in the present scenario, by electronic communications, and what is the driving force behind these electronic communications? The internet, the increase in information, technology, communications. So therefore, when we are trying to understand this idea of global village, this too has a huge linkage with the idea of culture, wherein somewhere, the globe, different parts of the globe are seemingly getting together to identify with each other as one community, linked by increase in electronic communication, information and technology. And internet is often seen as the driving force behind the idea of global village. However, when we are discussing the idea of global village, there is also a dispute, a debate here, that is this idea of global village universal or not? Then alongside the idea of global village, there is the idea of global culture. Today, with the rise of new forms of communication, new forms of transmission of ideas, goods and services, somewhere there are tendencies for development of a set of shared experiences, norms, symbols, ideas that are uniting the people at global level. And this set of shared experiences that is developing at the global level signifies global culture. Now, when we are trying to debate global village, global culture, let's take an example from a book in order to make it much more easier for our learning. We're going to be discussing this book, Globalization, by Manfred Steger. We all know that globalization encompasses variety of economic, political, cultural, ideological, environmental practices that have definitely accelerated in the last few decades. There is a debate that whether this globalization was helpful or not. There is definitely a question whether globalization is good or bad. But however, when we look at the narrative of transmission, English emerged as a multifaceted system encompassing global, regional and local aspects of social life. And this is the example that we pick up from the book Globalization by Manfred Steger, explaining that how English, with a multifaceted system of its own, led to integration of global, regional, local aspects of social life. And therefore, when we are trying to look at this debate, there is a larger debate, that is how, with this propagation of English via domains of information, communication and technology, the idea of shared experience of a global culture, the idea of getting together in the form of a closed group network via global village also emerged. Then alongside the debates that are going on in the realm of culture, there is this concept of popular culture. That is popular culture, again when we are debating popular culture, there are other parallel debates also. At the first, let's understand how do we differ, how do we understand by popular culture. Popular culture exists or predominates a society at a certain point of time. Again, some examples, for example, entertainment, our movies, our music, television, multimedia games, sports, news, people, places in the news, fashion, politics, technology, changes in technology, all of it are part of the ambit of popular culture, primarily the norms that predominate a society at a certain point, a particular point in time. Now, when we are trying to debate popular culture, again let's understand the problematics that are involved in this idea of popular culture, namely, is it universal? Secondly, namely, does this idea of popular culture, does it lead to more diversity, or it is leading to elimination of diversity by putting us together in a homogeneous realm? And lastly, is this idea of popular culture reflective of the social churnings and balances with respect to inequalities? And all these issues definitely has a connect to the social processes that are undergoing within the larger realm of global affairs too. We take this book, Whose Global Village? Rethinking How Technology Shapes Our World by Ramesh Srinivasan from New York University Press, 2018. Now, this very title of the book, Whose Global Village, is giving us a lot of thinking points as to how culture is impacting global relations, and this impact is definitely having a link to the domestic arena also. We all know that today all nations are living in a digital age. Nations' domestic policies are being refined to move towards digitalization. Now, at the same time, there is a debate that technology is also leading to new forms of linkages by leading to shrinking of time and space. That is, technology has shrunk the physical world. And this leads to the concept of global village, that is, all are connected as an online community. Information travels to the farthest places, and then with these new technologies, how they are becoming pervasive, increasingly shaping labor policies, labor work, economics and politics also. The debate then there is, does this reinforce the inequalities of globalization and also rarely giving a chance to the perspective of the bottoms of the digital divide, because not all have access to internet or to electronic communication. So therefore this book, Whose Global Village by Ramesh Srinivasan, invokes the same idea, that can we take the term of global village, global culture, popular culture emerging from thereof as a representative of entire society? Can we take it a reflection of all the social processes, or it is leading to concealing the differences? And most important, is it reinforcing therefore the inequalities that were already existing? And above all, when we are debating global village, what are we really then doing to cater to the digital divide that divides the nation? Then another book that is very important for us to understand as to how culture, when it permeates through norms, when it permeates to ideas, and ideas are also related to our psychology. So therefore, another important work that we look here is Psychology of Globalization, Identity, Ideology and Action. And these discussion on these books are also making one thing clear to us, that how today cultural diversification, cultural unity, national identity are important issues for not only national discourse but also complex issues in global diplomacy also. So when we look at the key contours of the book, Psychology of Globalization, Identity, Ideology and Action, there are two key domains that this book, by its very title, presents that what it's trying to touch at, that is social identity and collective action, followed by political ideology and attitudes. Now this impacts four specific topics: environmental challenges, consumer culture, international security, transnational migration and intranational cultural diversification. So therefore one as goes through this book, one finds that individual social representation and behavior are altered by globalizing process. At the same time, they also simultaneously contribute, do great work to these very processes. Globalization therefore then definitely affects our social identity, it has an impact on our collective action, and it also impacts our intergroup relations. The infrastructure therefore leads to different kinds of practices, and these kind of things therefore are becoming important. For example, when we look at the idea of global consumerism, how it shapes individual, how global consumerism leads to group formation and action, how people perceive and respond to global challenges such as climate change and migration. So therefore, when we try to look at this larger idea, that is identity, ideology and action, therefore are definitely impacted by the very psychological forces that are there in the realm of global politics and globalization thereof, and culture is an important ambit there. Now another work that we will try to look at right now is Culture in World Politics. This book has been edited, it's an edited work by Dominique Bridral, Andrews Oros and Marco Verjuel. This book gives an idea that what is world politics. When we look at from the realm of culture, we see it as a pattern of cooperation as well as conflict between different groups of people with different cultural backgrounds. then therefore one also cannot ignore the fact that the realm of international relations was dominated by ideas of statism, realism, high politics. Therefore the topic and the concepts associated with the idea of culture in global politics was ignored. With time, there has been an attempt to look at alternative ways of thinking, trying to understand what is therefore. Then the book makes an attempt to understand that how cultural studies can make an important contribution to understand, for example, cases of international violence, to understand issues emerging in international political economy. So therefore culture in world politics has a huge role to play, because today when we look at international violence, international political economy and other areas too, there is definitely a need for a new alternative way of thinking on part of policymakers and statesmen, and therefore the issue of culture and the implications of cultural studies definitely are important for all. Another theory that has an important implication for the history of global politics and international relations is that of modernization theory. Now, the main proponents of modernization theory was that traditional societies will develop as they adopt more modern practices. Now, it was assumed that modern states are wealthier and more powerful, and that their citizens are freer to enjoy a higher standard of living. When we look at the modernization theory, again this theory has been problematized and debated in the international relations. Battles have been fought over it, because somewhere the idea of colonialism, the idea of imperialism is also attributed to the modernization theory. Another book that we will take up for discussion in our study today is Modernization and Postmodernization, Cultural, Economic and Political Change. It is from the Princeton University Press, and this book is by Ronald Inglehart. Now, Ronald Inglehart makes some very important points. He says that economic development, cultural change and political change, they go together. There are certain predictable patterns here when we are trying to look at these points here. So, with industrialization comes mass mobilization. Mass mobilization leads to differences, differentiation in the gender roles, and all of it as it appears. Therefore, one sees here is that there are changes in world views, and then therefore they are reflected in the economic political environment, and at the same time they take place with generational time lag with considerable autonomy too. So then the debate comes in that advanced industrial society leads to shift in values, de-emphasizing the instrumental rationality that characterizes the industrial society. The postmodern values, then they bring new societal changes, including political institutions, decline of state socialist regimes, and all of it therefore has an important implications for the cultural churnings that take place in the domestic apparatus as well as within the international relations apparatus of a particular of the global community. Then again, when you go by the work of Ronald Inglehart, we see that belief systems and the political and socio-economic variables therefore are linked. And in this book, a very important work is done, that is world value surveys are undertaken to explain the churnings that are there in this modernization versus post-modernization transition and debate. Now, critical theory, when we look at the international relations theory apparatus and perspective, critical theory is an important work which one must always look into while analyzing culture in the global relations apparatus. Critical theory is reflective assessment. It is a critique of society and culture by applying knowledge from the social sciences and the realm of humanities to reveal, to challenge the power structure. Critical theory, we know that it has origins in sociology and literary criticism, but for the real purpose of international relations too. Critical theory has been made use of in order to give a reflective turn to international relations. As we saw that international relations was dominated by rational theories which were often seen as status quo. For example, realism, neorealism, liberalism and neoliberalism. With time, there was a reflectivist turn in international relations to have a better assessment, to present a critique of society and culture from the perspective of social sciences and humanities that are revealing, talking a lot about the power structure, and this critique of the power structure has an implications for the narrative of global politics also. An important school here, the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School led to rethinking of classical Marxism. They updated it in order to, to understand the socio-historical period. Now, the Frankfurt School was a group of scholars known for developing critical theory and popularizing the dialectic method of learning by interrogating society's contradiction. It is more, when we look at the prominent theorists, it is closely associated with the work of Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Heinrich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse. So when we look at these important work, it tells us that how Marxism was reinvented in order to question the contemporary contradictions. Now we all know that Marx's idea was to understand the dialectics via the dichotomy of the political and the economic processes. The economic processes provide the base on which the superstructure of culture, politics, law and society is based. And because this base is unequal, primarily divided between haves and haves not, the superstructure laid on this economic apparatus is therefore also unequal. And when we look at this Marxian analogy, this, when how Marx tries to invert the Hegelian dialectics, presenting it in the form of a historical materialism that is in all phases of history. Because the society was divided, therefore it had an impact on the prevailing cultural norms and values of that particular society also. When we look at the Greek time, the society was divided into freemen and slaves. In the Roman times, it was divided between patricians and plebeians. Followed by that, in feudal times, it was divided into vassals and serfs. During the time of Industrial Revolution, it was divided into factorymen and workers. And in the contemporary capitalist times, it is divided into rich versus poor. Once again, haves versus haves not. This dichotomy definitely impacts the superstructure, and culture is therefore one of that. The neo-Marxian group, primarily the Frankfurt School, they try to examine the effects of mass culture, the rise of consumer society on the working classes, which were to be instruments of revolution in the classical Marxist theory and scenario. Now this brings us again to the idea of mass culture. By mass culture, we imply that how technological developments have allowed for distribution of cultural products, music, films and art on a rampant mass scale. And therefore there is a debate. Is this mass culture, as we saw in the preceding debates also, is it really reflective of all the societal norms and forces? Can culture be placed on a homogeneous realm? Then alongside mass culture, which is also important for the processes that are going in global politics, is consumerism. Because today, when we are seeing that today non-state actors like transnational corporations, multinational corporations are focusing on consumerism. Because of consumerism, there is increase in spending of customers of money on material goods to attain a lifestyle in a capitalist economy. When we talk about consumerist culture, a country that is a prime leading example is United States of America. So these things also have an impact on the domestic policies as well as for global relations also, because the spending and the economic activities of an individual is being defined by the powerful forces and the churnings of the capitalist economy too, and consumerism therefore is also linked to the churnings of the norms and values implied in the cultural realm. So therefore the picture that one gets here is that there are myriad social and economic changes associated with globalization. There are various social, economic and other changes associated when we are debating the critique of globalization or presenting an alternative or asking to reverse globalization by deglobalization. Or at the same time, there are various myriad social and economic changes associated when we are presenting the other alternative, that is less re-globalized. And in all this, culture has a huge stake, and therefore culture is an important variable for global relations as well as national issues. Now, when we look at history of a lot of Latin, Afro-Asian countries, colonialism is an important aspect. Colonialism and culture are often linked. By colonialism, we imply how there was establishment, exploitation, maintenance, acquisition, expansion of colonies in one territory by people from another territory. Then at the same time, what were the root causes was the desire of wealthy nations to control, to dominate other nations' values, perceptions through culture, media, language, education, for their own economic reasons. Therefore, the debate that has often invoked in the realm of global relations, also in the realm of when we look at domestic policies and history of several nations, is that of cultural imperialism. This entire debate between North versus South, that is processes and practices of promoting one culture over other. And this often occurred, as the world history saw, during colonization, where one nation overpowered another country, typically one that is economically disadvantaged or militarily weaker. Then at the same time, when we are trying to debate culture, the critique of the prevailing practices of culture has often come from feminism too. And feminism, again, though it had its start in the literary criticism and literature and sociological apparatus, but it has also pervaded and made its way to international relations and global affairs too. And it has argued that culture needs to be reassessed, redefined. Therefore, feminism too has affected the debate, the issues prevailing in the realm of culture, and nations are factoring that in their global diplomatic apparatus. Feminism attempts to revalue and redefine the attributes, what goes into the larger thinking and policy making of male versus female. It tries to question patriarchal domination and exploitation that is also linked to several other aspects and societal process of a particular state, and this definitely has a connect to global issues too. Then there is this debate of rapprochement of culture, that how international security and social inclusion cannot be attained sustainably without a commitment to principles such as human dignity, solidarity, conviviality, and all these are cornerstones of human coexistence. Now these values they go a long way in establishing the idea of human coexistence in global relations. When we look at global affairs today, international organizations like UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, established in November 1949 with this mandate to contribute to building of peace, eradication of poverty, sustainable development, intercultural dialogue through education, sciences, culture, communication and information, is playing a very important role. Now let's look at some of the work that UNESCO is doing, and wherein culture and global politics are closely related. See, the idea of culture is questioning of who we are, what shapes our identity. Now, UNESCO through its work and United Nations through its consistent efforts has made a point that no development can be sustainable without including culture. For example, to take an example here, in September 2015, the United Nations General Assembly adopted 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with 17 ambitious goals to change and transform the world. And UNESCO underlines in all of its efforts the importance of culture. When we look at sustainable development goals, it has an impact on areas like quality education, sustainable cities, environment, economic growth, sustainable communication, production patterns, peaceful, inclusive society, gender equality, food security. All of it definitely are connected to the processes and the norms and values that go in a society to shape a culture. So therefore, another important event news that took place within the UNESCO ambit was that how one sees that from cultural heritage, one is leaping towards the area of cultural and creative industries. Culture therefore is an enabler as well as a driver of economic, social, environmental dimensions of sustainable development. The UNESCO's work, which tries to promote cultural diversity, and UNESCO's cultural conventions are some examples which are like key to the implementation of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this shows that how this work shows that how culture is also in application in real life practice essential and making it to the agenda of international organizations, as well as how many multinational and transnational organizations are factoring in culture in order to revamp their organizational behavior towards a global milieu. One of the recent news which we'll take to learn and expand our learning today is how United Nations General Assembly President Maria Fernanda Espinosa said that on the 20th anniversary of General Assembly's adoption of Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace. Now, this we have taken again from UN Archive, un.org, and we quote the statement that is, peace is more than the absence of war. It needs constant nurturing through pursuit of dignity and equality, of human rights, of justice, of respect, of understanding, of cooperation and multilateralism. So therefore, in all of it, when we are trying to look at global relations too, a culture of peace is inseparable from human rights, respect for diversity, fairer societies. So therefore, we see that how culture is then becoming a binding link between a sustainable national society and a sustainable collective global future. Because when human rights are respected in any country, when there is respect for diversity, vice versa in all the countries, definitely the larger macro picture that comes out here is that the world is sustainable. So therefore, it speaks out how norms and values are not just situated at a sub-unit level, but has an implication at a universal global level. So therefore, as we take our learning forward for culture, this shows us that how today in the realm of international relation there is a rethinking as to how we cannot situate world politics primarily in the realm of high politics domain. Today, national interest is multidimensional, and when national interest is multifaceted, there is a question that how today national interest must be reflective of all the interests a nation must cater to, and culture today has become an important variable. Now, when there is rethinking and reimagination of national interest and the idea of what actually goes in to define international, The idea that culture as shared patterns of behavior and interaction is important. When we look at culture, it is diverse. Its very etymology, Collier, tells us that it is about growing, cultivation, nurturing together. And in this idea of culture, of course, there is a huge diversity when we look as to how cultures from the West to the East to the Latin are different, and there are a lot of debates that are going on in the actual theory and practices of administration, both at national as well as international relations, to define the ambit of culture in global arena. We all knew that globalization led to interchange and exchange of ideas, goods and services at a rampant scale. This globalization was nothing new. But however, in the contemporary form, with rise of new forms of communication and technology, cultural globalization definitely intensified social relations. And with this intensification of social relations, when we are understanding culture in global relations, we also have to keep the debate understood as a point of analysis, that is, the debate between heterogeneity versus homogeneity, the debate between unity versus diversity, and the idea of increase or elimination of culture. Alongside the idea of culture in global relations, today there are concepts like global village, global culture, and all of it are saying that how, because of globalization, our practices, economic, political, ideological, cultural, they have accelerated, increased in the last few decades. And therefore, there are certain forces that are getting together, binding us together like a glue, and culture is definitely one of the areas wherein these forces have worked on. For example, rise of internet, binding us together as a global united online community. The rise of English, having huge impact for the social life at global, regional and other grassroots level. And therefore, as these forces are taking place within the ambit of culture, there are debates, the debates between popular versus parallel culture, the debate that is popular culture representative of all the social churnings, or it is just about that the tensions that are there in the pre-existing culture norms in a particular time. And there are questions also raised, that is this idea of global village representative of all, or do we need to think about it, that is namely primarily pointing towards digital divide, the challenges of digitalization that are important for nations to reflect not only at the national level but also at the global level. Then of course, when we are trying to look at culture, it also speaks to us as to how our collective actions are dependent on social norms and identity, how political ideology and attitude are impacted by individual social behavior also, and how these individual social behavior, they are changed simultaneously as well at the same time affected by the processes of global forces. So all of it comes under the ambit when we are trying to debate in the realm of culture and world politics. And within this, when we are trying to understand national diplomacy and the global diplomatic apparatus, one has to then situate the patterns of cooperation as well as conflict between groups of people, and these groups of people are interacting with each other on the premise that is there are differentiated cultural backgrounds. The topic of culture in international relations was earlier ignored. However, over a period of time, there has been an attempt to factor in cultural studies for understanding issues of international relations, to present alternative ways of thinking. Therefore, one also sees that how in the great debates going on within the realm of international relations, there was a shift in the perspective from a rational international theory paradigm to a reflectivist international theory paradigm, which is trying to present critique of the social processes and society in order to present a much more comprehensive picture of international relations and practices of international relations thereof. Culture always has an important issue, been an important issue while trying to understand history of nations. When we look at the First World War, Second World War, modernization theory, the debate on cultural colonialism, cultural imperialism, often the debate is there, and the questions of identity, namely the idea of having a global identity versus the need to safeguard the national identity, is also there in the discourse right now. So therefore, when we look at the ambit of culture in global politics, it's a huge ambit. Lot of thinking and rethinking is being undertaken by academia, by scholars, by media and researchers, and this rethinking and reimagination tells us that how the assessment of our norms, our values, our ideas and the culture thereof is significant to have a holistic, comprehensive analysis of the theory as well as practice of several aspects of global politics. We hope you all enjoyed the learnings today in the lecture Culture in World Politics. You have our email address. We look forward to your positive feedback. You have our email address. Please do send us your queries and questions. We will definitely reply to them. Have a great day ahead. Have a happy learning. Thank you.